something, just sets a flag, it goes onto a queue, and the main loop is just pulling things off the queue saying, oh, this object needs updating, this object needs updating, I got a key event, just process all these. And so one of those is the QuickTime media has been updated. And so it says, oh, update that, exploit happens. While our payload's doing something, the whole world freezes, which is not exactly subtle and stealthy, which is kind of makes it not as cool. And so the question was, can we rebuild the context and keep the thing running? And so this is what I call a second life support. It keeps it running, keeps it alive until the very end, then it just kind of dies a horrible death. But because I could probably fix that also, I just didn't really bother.
It doesn't die sometimes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I bet it won't die this time.
Right, we'll see.
It only used to die when you would exit at the end of, you're done playing Second Life and you go to exit. Sometimes it would die, but it doesn't even always do that.
Oh, nice. At least for me, usually when I exit, it just exits quickly. So if you don't know, that's it crashing. So I should have mentioned that. So what we do is, it doesn't really matter that we're still executing in a exception handling filter context. This is kind of like a signal handler. It's special. It's actually not that special in Windows. It's just kind of gives it a new stack and stuff. So we just basically jump to the main loop again and just keep pulling down events. And if we do that and do some fix-ups to some global variables like the what's called s current depth, basically is kind of what it uses for its timers to make sure that it's not being re-entrant. Well, if we just fool it saying, yeah, you're executing within yourself again, but don't worry about it, it'll be fine. It just keeps running. And it's great, is that everything that we've been able to do keeps working. And what this allows us to do is just inject the payload DLL completely silently. There's no pause in the game. You just keep on going, and you have the Metasploit payload can take as long as it needs to send that DLL over. It gets injected, it can sit there and wait, it can do whatever it wants, and we just have this subversive agent running in your Second Life viewer that lets us do whatever we want to you or your avatar or your computer. And it wouldn't be one of my presentations if I didn't have a overly dense slide full of information that no one's going to be able to absorb in 30 seconds anyway, but I think I just put it up there. Just kind of show it's really not that complicated. Just jump forward, jump back, call a new thread, so that basically the new thread executes at the bottom of the payload, which will go on to the Metasploit.
So the new thread is the Metasploit payload, and then what he's going to say next is to main loop.
Yeah, so that, like Charlie said, new thread does that. Just need to give it a little more stack space because the Metasploit payloads assume that they can write forward up the stack to a certain extent, because usually that's the case. But when you're executing directly out of a new thread, you have like 132 bytes, really not much space at all. So just give it some stack space. And then, while that new thread has started, we basically patch up the scurrent depth variable and just call the main loop. And, call exit process at the end, but that doesn't really clean things up nicely because I have to call a Second Life specific exit function. But didn't do that yet. So was that clear for everyone? If not, here's a picture. So it shows LL media impl is a media implementation object. It fires an event saying, I need something, I need an update. Jumps into the QuickTime movies task, which does whatever needs to be done for the movie. So in this case, it's download from the RTSP server and and start the movie. And then at that point, the little red X means the exploit happens. Bad stuff happens. It gets totally confused. And so we basically fork off into a new thread that executes the payload on the far right, and then just jump back into the main loop. So it's conceptually pretty simple. And so now we have Second Life running, Metasploit. The Second Life viewer running totally cleanly, no issues, and we can execute any Metasploit payload that we want. And there's literally 1,000 of them. So you can choose whichever one you want. But popping a shell, that's so 1999. DLL injection I find way more interesting because we can code up whatever we want, something application specific, and then just throw that in. And then just wait.
Right, so now we can do whatever we can inject any DLL we want into the process. And the question is, what do we put in this DLL? And writing a DLL in C is way easier than writing big nasty shellcode in assembly. Again, we could take over the machine, but we want to do something a little more clever. We want to take over their avatar. There's basically two ways you can do it. You can either, while you're running in the context of Second Life, send the packets to the Second Life server that make it think you're doing things, or you can just make the Second Life viewer, you can just call the functions that do the things you want in the Second Life viewer and let it handle all the packets. So if you want to send the game packets, you could certainly do that. Just watch the traffic, figure out what's going on. There's even some documentation on the internet from before Second Life was open source. But it's going to be tough because each one has to be formed specially. If there's more than one packet required or an exchange, you have to keep track of that. You have to worry about using the sockets that are already there. The actual traffic itself is actually kind of nasty. It's all UDP, and it's like, depending on where you are in the world, it's going to different servers and stuff. So we didn't do this. What we did was we decided we would just call the functions inside the Second Life client and have it do everything for us. And again, these are not APIs. These are not intended to be called except by functions that are compiled at the same time as it. But that doesn't mean we can't do it. Second Life is C++. So actually, most of the functions are methods of classes. So it's a little more complicated. You can't just call a function and hope it'll work, because there's going to be like global variables. You have to make the arguments right. There could be other class members that screw you up. So what we did is we just wrote our payload in C++, compiled it into a DLL, and then used Metasploit to inject it. All right, so how do you call these functions? Well, to figure out what function to call, you can either hook a debugger to Second Life and do something that you want to have done, and then see what gets called, or you can just look through the source code, or use IDA, look through the disassembly, or some combination thereof. Usually, I just grep through the source code, and they're pretty good about coming up with function names that are pretty descriptive. And then you got to go and figure out what other dependencies there are to make it so where you can call these functions. So is it a class? What global variables is used? What kind of arguments does it have? That sort of stuff. And I'll give you some examples of that. So there was one function I always wanted to call, but someone talked me out of it. So it's called like remove all clothes or something like that. Go ahead.
We don't want everyone to leave. We're just going to say that our demo doesn't use that function.
Yeah.
But it's still interesting.
Yeah. But anyway, so that's the idea. Is if you can just look through the source and you'll find functions named like that, and you're like, that sounds like a good one to call. Okay. So how do you do this? Well, this is an example. So I want to call the function getBalance, which says how much money a person has. This is so. It turns out that this function actually gets inlined in the binary, so it's not actually even a function. And this is Lyndon is talking to us. He said we can have a good conference. Anyway, if you look in the middle there, it says, which you can actually hear me. Oh, that's cool. Anyway, so if you look in the second little box there, it moves a certain thing that I've told IDA is called G status bar. It moves it into a variable EAX, and then and then that's it. And then it dereferences one F0 from that. So G status bar is some structure or class, and then there's some member, some offset from it, and it just dereferences that. And so once you see how it works, then you can go and write the C code like that and get the same exact value. So I steal the address out of the binary, and by the way, that means our payload is going to be dependent on the version of Second Life. So if you want to get exploited by us, you have to have the exact same version. So that I get that address, I add an offset to it, dereference it, and now I have the balance. I know how much money the person has in 2 lines of C. All right, so that was easy. What if it's a little more complicated? So this is the function that tells me it tells a client to give money to another person, which is I want them to give money to me. So you declare a function pointer. So this is exactly out of their source code what it looks like. Well, not exactly, but it's real close. And then you use a debugger to see how this thing gets called.